Hello everyone, welcome back to Crime Whisper. I'm here with another case to guide you through. Whether you're here to learn, to reflect, or even to fall asleep, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Case 1. The Colley family murders Amanda Colley lived with her family in Mirabella, an upscale, peaceful neighborhood in St. Augustine, Florida. She and her husband, James Colley Jr., had chosen the area to raise their 2 children. From the outside, their life looked picture perfect. Neighbors would often see James laughing with their kids, 6-year-old Trey and 4-year-old Avery, playing outside in the cul-de-sac. The couple was known for hosting lively gatherings, filled with drinks, music, and friendship. Even as their marriage began to fall apart, Amanda and James kept things civil, or so it seemed. Whatever issues they had stayed hidden behind closed doors. Which is why what happened on the morning of August 27, 2015, sent shockwaves through the community. That morning, Amanda's friend Rachel Riss received a disturbing message. Something was wrong. Rachel, Amanda, and their friend Lindy Dobbins had shared a deep, long-standing friendship. They babysat each other's kids, leaned on one another in tough times, and always answered each other's calls. So when Amanda reached out, they didn't hesitate. Rachel dropped off her kids at school and headed straight to Amanda's house, with a quick stop to get her hair done, unaware that Amanda was already walking into chaos. When Amanda returned home that morning, she stepped into a nightmare. Her once spotless house was completely destroyed. Drawers were ripped out. Clothes, papers, and belongings were strewn everywhere. Her TV had been smashed. Strangely, nothing had been stolen. It looked like someone had been searching for something. At that moment, Amanda may have realized just how much danger she was in, so she called in reinforcements. Rachel, Lindy, and Lamar Duberly, her boyfriend, not Amanda, had officially separated from James back in June, but her relationship with Lamar had started months before, in April. At first, it was professional. Both worked in corporate management at Fanatics, a sportswear company. But as Amanda's marriage unraveled, Lamar became her source of comfort and stability. Lamar wasn't just a boyfriend, he was a former military officer, with credentials that included the U.S. Naval Academy, Marine Corps, University, and even the Pentagon. Calm, confident, and composed. Lamar was someone you'd want by your side in a crisis, so when Amanda found her home ransacked, he was the first person she FaceTimed. Soon, everyone arrived at the house. Amanda, Rachel, Lindy, and Lamar. They began walking through the destruction, trying to piece together what had happened. Amanda and Lindy stayed upstairs, while Lamar took Rachel into the garage to assess the damage. It was supposed to be a moment to breathe, but before they could even process what was happening, gunshots rang out. Standing in the backyard was a man with a handgun, James Colley. He was shouting, "Where is he? Where is he?" over and over as he fired into the house. Bullets shattered the living room windows. Glass exploded, the air filled with rage and gunfire. James wasn't firing randomly. He was hunting someone, and Lamar instantly knew who. He didn't wait. He yelled for everyone to run and bolted out of the garage. Sprinting between 2 houses in the cold Dossack, I thought I was the target. I was unarmed, so I left. If you were in Lamar's shoes, what would you have done? Would you have stayed to protect Amanda, or would you have made the same decision? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Back inside, Amanda and Lindy had no time to escape. They ran upstairs and tried to hide. Amanda locked herself in the bathroom, while Rachel and Lindy barricaded themselves in the master bedroom closet. Rachel held the doorknob with one hand, her foot bracing the door. Lindy crouched behind a dresser. They were silent, barely breathing. Then footsteps. James had stormed through the front door. He pounded up the stairs, gun still drawn, fury in every step. He wanted Lamar, but Lamar was gone. Instead, he found Amanda from inside the closet. Rachel and Lindy could hear Amanda and James shouting, "Where is he? He's not here. I don't know where he is." James tried to break into the closet. Amanda shouted, "That's Rachel and Lindy in there." Lindy confirmed, calling out her name. Rachel stayed silent, and then a gunshot. Rachel never heard Amanda's voice again, but James wasn't done. His rage turned toward the closet. He banged on the door, shouting, open it now." When no one responded, he fired through the door. The bullet grazed Rachel's arm, and the pain caused her to stumble. That brief moment gave James the chance he needed. He kicked the door open and stormed inside. Rachel, injured but alive, managed to flee the room and run into the neighborhood for help. James didn't follow her. His target was Lindy. By the time police arrived, it was too late. James had vanished, but what he left behind was unspeakable. Amanda had been shot 9 times. Lindy, 3. Both were dead. James had first used a 9mm handgun. When that ran out of bullets, he pulled out a .45 caliber, a backup weapon. He had come prepared. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was cold, calculated, and deliberate. Outro, the Collie home, once full of life and laughter, had become a scene of unimaginable horror. And yet, for those who survived, the trauma didn't end when the bullets stopped. Thank you for staying with me through this tragic story. If you found this case haunting, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Crime Whisper, and hit the bell so you never miss another story. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay safe and whisper gently into the dark. Segment title: A House Full of Rage, the true story of Amanda and James Collie. We don't know much about the early days of Amanda and James Collie's relationship. What we do know is this: by 2015, Amanda was 36, a year older than James. She had been born in Orlando, Florida, and had carved out a successful, respected life. She was thriving both professionally and socially, surrounded by people who admired and loved her. James, on the surface, seemed just as polished. He worked in the mortgage industry and lived what appeared to be a stable family life. Neighbors saw him as a dedicated father, always with his children, teaching them to swim, playing outside, ever present. His sister, Crystal, often spoke of him in glowing terms. A family man, loving and attentive. But James was not the man he seemed, behind the image of the devoted dad and hard-working professional. James Collie harbored a deep, dangerous darkness, one rooted in his own traumatic past. His childhood was stained by violence. According to his sister, James had witnessed disturbing moments of uncontrolled rage in his home. He had seen his mother fly into fits of fury over his father's infidelity, once sitting on the stairs with a baseball bat, waiting for her husband to walk through the door. When he did, she struck him repeatedly, consumed by rage. In another outburst, she grabbed a knife during an argument, and through it all, young James watched, powerless. These were the first seeds of violence sown into his psyche. The scars of that childhood didn't fade, they festered. A defense attorney might say James was a product of his environment, trapped in a cycle of trauma he never escaped. But trauma doesn't excuse what he did. Not on that day. Not ever. By late August 2015, Amanda and James had been separated for months. James had supposedly moved on, even seeing someone new, but his obsession with Amanda had only intensified. She, on the other hand, was trying to rebuild, trying to move on. That was her only crime, wanting peace, wanting freedom, and for that, she paid with her life. James' descent into violence didn't happen overnight. It built slowly, methodically, and dangerously. A neighbor had sent him a photo of Amanda's new partner, Lamar, shirtless, mowing her lawn. That image sent him spiraling. his ego shattered, his rage ignited. He began bombarding Amanda with text messages and voicemails, threatening, possessive, and chilling. "Oh, and your boyfriend has been parking at the playground and walking around the back. The whole neighborhood knows. Just have him park in front like a man. Don't worry. I'll speak with him face to face, sooner rather than later." Amanda, trying to calm him down, replied, "He's not my boyfriend, like I've told you before. He helps me with yard work, painting, moving furniture, nothing more." But James wasn't listening. "Then why doesn't he park in the driveway? I guess he's married, right? I've got a picture of him." These weren't just jealous messages, they were threats, and James had a history of acting on threats. Amanda had already filed a domestic violence injunction against him. James had violated that order before, once by stealing her clothes and setting them on fire in her yard. In fact, on the very morning of August 27th, just hours before the murders, James appeared in court for violating that injunction. He sat there, calm, composed. No one could have known that less than an hour later, he would commit an atrocity. Like many abusive partners, James was a contradiction. 1 minute, pleading for forgiveness. The next, consumed by paranoid rage, just a day before the murders. On August 26th, he texted Amanda, "Please try to start forgiving me so we can move on. I really miss you and our family." But this wasn't love. It was manipulation, a desperate grasp for control. And when that failed, he chose violence. In the early morning hours of August 27th, around 4 a.m., James broke into Amanda's home. He wasn't there to apologize. He wasn't there for reconciliation. He was there to confirm his worst fear, that Amanda had moved on. Inside he found the proof: men's clothing, adult toys, personal items that made it clear Amanda had a new partner. That discovery was the final trigger. Fury consumed him. He destroyed everything, tearing open drawers, flipping furniture, smashing her belongings. He turned Amanda's once safe, sacred space into a war zone. By the time Amanda returned home, at 9 o'clock that morning, she walked into pure chaos. Her home was unrecognizable, trashed, overturned, ransacked, panicked, shaken, and unsure of what to do. Amanda called her closest friends, Lindy and Rachel, for help. What she didn't realize was that James was far from done. In fact, he was just getting started. Not long after the rampage, James sent Amanda a final, unnerving message. "You're an awesome person. Don't take me from my kids. It's all I have. Call me, or I'm going to come find you." The message was soaked in desperation, but underneath it lurked something far more sinister. Amanda called him back at 9:41 a.m., just minutes after he had left court. The contents of that call remain unknown, but whatever she said, it wasn't enough. James was now fully unhinged. He stopped at a gas station, then his sister's house, then back to another station. Somewhere in between, he armed himself, not with one, but 2 guns, a 9mm and a .45 caliber handgun. He had a plan. This was not impulse. It was premeditated. During his drive, James made one final phone call to his father, a woman walking. Her dog nearby later recalled overhearing the conversation. She heard James' father begging him to turn around. "Please, son, come back. Come get your truck. Everybody knows what you've been through." But James' response was chilling. "I just can't take this anymore." And with that, he hung up and continued toward Amanda's home, his mind made up. James didn't park in the driveway like a guest. He didn't knock on the door like a man. He parked on a nearby street and crept through the backyard like a predator stalking his prey. He raised his gun and opened fire, shooting through the living room windows. Inside, chaos erupted. Rachel and Lamar were caught completely off guard. Gunshots tore through glass. Amanda screamed. James shouted, demanding answers. "Where is he? Where the F? Asterisk, asterisk, Asterisk is he. Amanda tried to run. James was faster. He chased her, cornered her, and gunned her down in cold blood. Lindy, who had arrived moments earlier, barely had time to react. She too was shot and killed. James continued his rampage, stalking the house, determined to destroy anyone who had witnessed or challenged him. And then, just like that, he vanished. But he had left behind 2 surviving witnesses, Lamar, who had escaped, and Rachel wounded, but alive. They told police exactly what happened. They named the killer. The manhunt for James Terry Colley Jr. was on. Law enforcement launched a full-scale search, knowing that James was armed, unstable, and capable of more violence. Later, that night, nearly 600 miles away in Norton, Virginia, a woman called 911. She was panicked, saying a reckless driver had nearly forced her off the road. And what happened next, we'll cover in Part 2. Part 2. The fallout. Justice for Amanda and Lindy as the manhunt for James Colley spread across state lines. An unexpected 911 call came in from Norton, Virginia. A distressed woman reported a terrifying incident on the highway. "He just forced me to stop in the middle of the road," she said breathlessly. "He tried to hit me. I have 3 small children in the car." She was panicked, and rightfully so. Her call helped police track down the reckless driver's vehicle. Inside, they found him, James Terry Colley Jr., along with multiple firearms. The manhunt was over. James was taken into custody and formally charged with a devastating list of crimes, each reflecting the full weight of his actions. 2 counts of first-degree murder for the killings of Amanda Colley and Lindy Dobbins. 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder for Lamar Dubberly and Rachel Hendrick, who had narrowly survived. Additional charges included burglary with assault, burglary of a dwelling, and aggravated stalking in violation of an injunction. Prosecutors were determined to hold him accountable, and they were ready for trial. James' defense team pursued a controversial strategy. They claimed his actions weren't premeditated. Instead, they argued that James was in an altered mental state brought on by prescription drugs, alcohol, and a sleep disorder called parasomnia, a condition associated with unusual behaviors during sleep, such as sleepwalking. A psychiatrist testified that James had taken Ambien and other substances, leaving him in what they described as a confused, dreamlike state. In essence, they claimed he was sleepwalking through the murders, but that defense quickly unraveled. Just 90 minutes before the attack, James had been in court, calm, alert, rational. He answered every question clearly. He showed no signs of impairment, and he explicitly denied being under the influence of any substances. That statement alone directly contradicted his defense. Surveillance footage, call logs, GPS records, and witness testimony built a damning timeline. James had planned every step. He had armed himself. He had stalked Amanda's home. He had waited. He had struck. This wasn't sleepwalking. It was premeditated murder. When the trial concluded, the jury didn't hesitate. They returned a unanimous guilty verdict on all counts, and when it came time for sentencing, the jury once again reached a unanimous decision: death. The prosecution had presented for aggravating factors beyond reasonable doubt. James had a previous violent felony. He committed multiple murders and attempted murders during the same incident. The murders occurred during a burglary. The killings were especially heinous, atrocious, cruel, and coldly calculated. Perhaps the most haunting testimony came from the medical examiner, who revealed a chilling truth. Amanda had been fully conscious during the attack. She was shot 9 times before she finally succumbed. That brutality, that slow, deliberate destruction of a human life was undeniable. This wasn't a moment of madness. It was an execution. In November 2018, James Colley was formally sentenced to death. He appealed the ruling, but in 2020, the sentence was upheld. Today, he remains on death row, awaiting execution. But the legal outcome didn't end the pain. What made the case even more controversial was the unwavering support James received from parts of his own family, particularly his sister. Before the trial, she publicly defended him. In one recorded jail call, she even led a prayer, pleading for his safe release. She believed in his innocence, despite the overwhelming evidence. But no amount of prayer could undo what he had done. No faith could resurrect the two women whose lives he had stolen, mothers who together left behind 5 young children. During the trial, Lindy Dobbins' husband bravely took the stand. His words were raw, soaked in grief. He spoke about the unbearable pain of losing his wife, about their children having to grow up without their mother. He described the quiet holes left in everyday life, empty chairs at Little League games, swim meets dedicated in her honor. Swimming for Lindy, the shirts read, a reminder of a life interrupted, a reminder of a woman who will never see her daughter swim again. So now, ask yourself, if James were your brother, would you fight for his freedom? Or would you acknowledge the pain he caused, the lives he destroyed? There is no easy answer, but what's clear is this: domestic violence doesn't happen in isolation. Left unchecked, it can evolve into something unimaginable, something final. Amanda just wanted to live. Lindy just wanted to help a friend, and for that, they were murdered. Transition. Case 2. The Miyazawa family murders. Now we move from Florida to Tokyo, from a case of calculated domestic violence to one of Japan's most haunting unsolved mysteries. By the end of the year 2000, only a few houses remained in the area near Sasagaya Park, in Setagaya Ward. One of them belonged to the Miyazawa family at first glance. Their home looked like a single large residence, but it was actually 2 connected dwellings. One half belonged to the Miyazawa's 44-year-old Mikio, his wife Yasuko, their daughter Nina, and their son Rei. The other was occupied by Yasuko's mother and occasionally visited by other relatives. The family had already made plans to relocate. Their land had been sold to make way for the expansion of the park, but Yasuko delayed the move, deeply concerned about the impact the transition might have on Rei, who had a developmental disorder. She wanted stability, and as a dedicated tutor who ran a cram school out of their home, she understood just how vital that stability was for children, not just her own, but all those she taught. The Miyazawas were well-liked, hard-working, quiet, a loving, close-knit family. But on the night of December 30th, 2000, that peace would be shattered forever. The day began like any other. The family spent the afternoon shopping near Kito's Karasuyama Station, preparing for New Year festivities. They returned home in the evening for a quiet night, indoors, eating dinner, watching television, enjoying each other's company. They had no idea they were living their final hours. Sometime after 11 p.m., an unidentified man made his way through Sasagaya Park, approaching the Miyazawa home from the rear, using a backyard fence and possibly a nearby tree. He climbed to the second floor, where he entered through the bathroom window. The screen was removed, and broken branches were later found near the base of the tree, evidence of his method. From there, the killer crept into the house. His first stop was 6-year-old Rei's bedroom. Rei was fast asleep, small, vulnerable, unaware. Unlike the others, he wasn't stabbed. The killer strangled him, quietly, silently, leaving the child's lifeless body in bed before continuing his spree. What happened next remains debated to this day. Reports vary, but one account suggests that Mikio Miyazawa, the father, heard a noise and went to investigate. He reportedly confronted the intruder face to face, possibly downstairs. The killer pulled out a sashimi knife, a long razor-sharp blade used for slicing fish, and launched a savage attack. Mikio fought back. He tried to resist, but he was stabbed multiple times, eventually falling near the staircase. One version claims he collapsed while running up the stairs. Another says he was attacked near the bottom and bled out, trying to escape. Either way, His body was found at the base of the stairs, and part of the murder weapon was still lodged in his skull. The killer wasn't done. He made his way to the attic where 41-year-old Yasuko and 8-year-old Nina were sleeping. Forensic evidence suggests they were attacked in their sleep. Bloodstains on the futon paint a grim picture of a sudden, merciless strike. At some point, the killer's knife broke, so he went downstairs and fetched another weapon, a kitchen knife, from the family's own drawer. He came back upstairs to finish the job. Case 2 continued: the Setagaya family murders. The Goldilocks killer, Yasuko, and 8-year-old Nina didn't die immediately in a desperate attempt to escape. The two had tried to climb down the foldable attic ladder that led from the upper level to the rest of the house. But the killer was too fast. Their bodies were later found huddled together at the top of the second-floor staircase. It was clear they had fought for their lives, and Nina suffered a fate even more horrific than the others. She had been stabbed repeatedly, but that wasn't all. She had been beaten with such force that several of her teeth were knocked out. The most chilling detail came later, through forensic analysis. Nina was the last to die. Out of the thousands of cases we've explored on this channel, few are as bizarre and unsettling as this one. A family of 4, slaughtered in their own home. 2 parents and 2 children. And it should have ended there, but it didn't. What happened after the murders would defy logic, and earn this case the nickname, the Goldilocks murder. Unlike most killers who flee the scene in a panic, this intruder stayed. Evidence indicates that he remained inside the Miyazawa home for at least 2 hours after the killings, possibly longer. He didn't hide. He moved about the house casually, as if it were his own. What he did next would shock even seasoned investigators. He walked into the kitchen, stepping over the very bodies he had left behind, opened the fridge, and began to eat. He consumed several tubs of ice cream, a bottle of barley tea, and possibly even a slice of melon. But it was how he ate the ice cream that disturbed investigators the most. He squeezed the tubs until the contents rose to the top, then bit directly into them, leaving behind fingerprints and saliva. It was as if he didn't care about being caught. Or worse, he wanted to be found at some point. The killer realized he'd injured his hand, likely when the sashimi knife broke while stabbing Mikio. Rather than flee, he simply fetched the family's first aid kit, patched himself up, and left the bloody bandages behind in plain sight. That careless act would later provide police with a valuable blood sample, rich with DNA. But his strange behavior didn't stop there. He rifled through personal documents in the storage room on the first floor. Then, curiously, carried an entire drawer's worth of paperwork upstairs and dumped the papers into the bathtub. To this day, no one knows why. And then came the most bizarre detail of all. He used the bathroom, and DEFECAT, he left it unflushed, contaminating the crime scene even further, and providing yet another DNA sample after that. He wiped his bloody hands on a bathroom towel and continued moving about the house. Some reports even suggest he laid down on the family's sofa and took a nap, although this remains unconfirmed. What we do know is this: at some point, the killer began to remove his clothing. He left behind his jacket, scarf, hat, and shirt, as well as 2 handkerchiefs, a pair of gloves, and a grand black fanny pack. Even more incredibly, both murder weapons, the sashimi knife he brought and the kitchen knife he used from the family's drawer, were also left behind at 1:18 a.m. Something even more chilling happened. The family's computer was powered on, according to system logs. Not only did the killer turn it on, he created a new folder on the desktop. Some reports even suggest he visited the website of a local theater company, though this has never been confirmed. Just hours after butchering an entire family, the killer was using their computer.com, deliberate, methodical. A second log showed the computer activating again at 10 a.m. Initially, police feared this meant The killer had stayed in the house for 10 hours after the murders, but further analysis revealed that this second activation was likely accidental, caused when Yasuko's mother, Haruko, entered the home and bumped the mouse, waking it from sleep mode. This meant the killer likely left between 1:18 a.m. and sunrise. But even 2 hours inside that house was more than enough for this case to become one of the most disturbing, unsolved crimes in Japanese history, discovery, and evidence. Around 10:30 a.m., Haruko entered the home, concerned after Yasuko failed to answer her calls. What she found would haunt her forever: her son-in-law, Makio, lying lifeless at the bottom of the stairs. Panicked, she called the police. What law enforcement found was beyond comprehension. 4 brutally murdered family members. Blood, fingerprints, footprints, saliva, hair, unflushed feces, bloody bandages, discarded clothing, shoes, and both murder weapons. One investigator later described the home as a mountain of forensic treasure. Everyone believed the case would be solved. Quickly, they were wrong. Forensic clues and profile. The killer's clothing left behind painted a surprisingly clear picture. A gray crusher bucket, hata white baseball shirt with purple sleeves, say cheap. Plaid scarfe, Uniqlo AirTech jacket, gray and black fanny pack. A pair of black gloves. The footprints matched sleazer sneakers. Size 27.5 centimeters. Roughly a US men's size. 9.5. Investigators traced the shoes and discovered something shocking. That particular shoe size was never sold in Japan. It was only sold in South Korea. This suggested the killer had either lived in or visited Korea. The clue led investigators to consider that the suspect could be a Korean national, or at least someone with strong ties to South Korea. DNA and physical profile. Despite all the evidence, there were no fingerprint matches in Japan's database, suggesting the suspect had no criminal record in the country. But DNA testing offered more. The killer was male, with type A blood. Estimated age, 15 to 35 years old, based on athletic ability and entry method. Height, 5'6" inches to 5 feet 7, slender build, indicated by the 32-inch waist on his hip. Bag. His last meal, deduced from feces, included string beans and sesame seeds. Despite all this, no suspect has ever been arrested. Authorities distributed composite sketches and visual breakdowns of the killer's clothing, hoping for recognition. But no name ever came forward, and much of the clothing, it was mass-produced, sold in hundreds of stores, offering little help in narrowing down a suspect. But there were 2 objects that provided real clues: the sleazer sneakers not sold in Japan, only in Korea, and the gray fanny pack, which was linked to a small manufacturing batch also distributed outside Japanese. Findings led police to begin collaborating with Korean authorities, and yet, despite DNA samples, clothing, fingerprints, and a timeline of the suspect's movements, the killer remains unknown. To be continued. The Sepagaya family massacre is one of the most well-documented yet unresolved cases in Japanese history. The evidence is there, the profile is clear, and yet the name, the motive, and the full truth remain lost. In the next episode of Crime Whisper, we'll explore the theories behind who this killer might have been. Was it a military deserter, a foreign drifter, or someone with a deeply personal connection to the Miyazawas? We'll also dive into the failures of the investigation, the cultural barriers in DNA sharing, and why this case still haunts investigators to this day. Case, forensics, motive, and the military theory. When Japanese authorities arrived at the crime scene, they immediately recognized the mountain of forensic evidence left behind: fingerprints, blood, saliva, DNA-rich feces, and personal belongings. Hoping for a swift resolution, investigators reached out to South Korea, where the killer's sleazer sneakers had been exclusively sold. Korean police agreed to cooperate. They ran the fingerprints collected from the Miyazawa home through their national criminal database. But once again, no matches. It was another dead end. But then came a new clue, one that expanded the investigation, far beyond Asia, inside the suspect's gray hip bag. Forensic analysts discovered grip tape, commonly used on skateboards, trace amounts of Drakkar, Noir, Cologne, a men's fragrant sand, most strangely tiny particles of sand. This wasn't just any sand. After lab analysis, scientists confirmed the particles did not originate in Japan. They came from the United States, specifically the Los Angeles area. This revelation completely shattered previous assumptions. It suggested the killer may have either visited, lived, or even originated from the US, possibly with international connections. Investigators were forced to re-examine everything: new leads, taxi ride, and medical visit. Over the following months, new leads emerged, some helpful, others only deepening the mystery. One promising report came from a local taxi driver working the night of the murders. The driver recalled picking up 3 men near the Miyazawa residence shortly after the estimated time of death. All were within the suspect's estimated age range and build, and notably, one of them appeared injured, leaving blood on the seat before exiting. Was it possible there had been more than one perpetrator? This clashed with the forensic evidence, which overwhelmingly pointed to a lone killer. Still, it raised questions. Could the other 2 have been lookouts or accomplices? Or was this sighting simply unrelated? Another report came from a clinic near Tabanoko Station, several hours north of SETAGAYA. Staff recalled treating a man in his 30s who came in with a deep hand injury, consistent with the kind of wound that would result from a broken sashimi knife. But when asked how it happened, the man refused to explain. His silence alarmed the staff enough that they alerted the police. Was this the same man who left behind bandaged gauze in the Miyazawa's bathroom? Investigators couldn't be sure. 2 handkerchiefs and a strange ritual among the items left behind were 2 handkerchiefs. One was intact, the other had a hole cut through the center. Police, baffled, turned to the public for help identifying their use. Some theorized the handkerchief with the hole was used to wrap the handle of a knife, a technique commonly used by fishermen when handling slippery fish like tuna. Others suggested one cloth may have been used as a grip, while the other served as a mask to conceal the killer's identity. But this theory introduced a contradiction. Why would the killer take steps to avoid leaving fingerprints on the weapon, when he had left them all over the house, on doorknobs, light switches, food containers, and more? This inconsistency added to the growing list of unanswered questions, searching for motive, robbery, rage, or revenge. Despite the overwhelming volume of physical evidence, investigators were stuck on one central problem. Why? The Mia family was universally described as kind, helpful, and well-liked. They had no known enemies, no debts, and no scandals. At first, police considered the most obvious explanation: burglary gone wrong. But the timeline didn't support this. Most burglars strike when a home is empty, not when the entire family is inside, asleep. Even more disturbing was the fact that the killer's first act was to strangle 6-year-old Ray, who posed no threat at all. If theft were the goal, why immediately target a sleeping child after slaughtering the family? The intruder made a half-hearted attempt to rifle through personal items, even carrying documents to the upstairs bathtub, but took almost nothing of value. But some reports suggested he may have stolen about 150,000 yen, around 1,500 United States dollars. Investigators were stunned to find that over $2,000 in cash had been left behind. Clearly, money wasn't the motive. The psychological profile: a killer without remorse, with robbery ruled out. Investigators turned to something darker. Was this the work of a psychopath or a serial killer in waiting? What stood out most was the bizarre behavior after the killings. Rather than fleeing, the killer stayed. He ate the family's food, used their toilet, and possibly slept on their couch, while their bodies lay lifeless nearby. It suggested a total lack of remorse, or a deeply deranged mind. The brutality of the attacks, particularly against the women in the family, further hinted at misogynistic rage. Yasuko, the mother, sustained horrific injuries. Her wounds indicated she fought with everything she had until her final breath. Nina, just 8 years old, was the last to die. Her small body had been beaten and stabbed excessively. Even after death, her teeth shattered, her internal organs crushed. This kind of overkill often indicates personal hatred. But if the killer didn't know the family, what drove this? Rage? The skater theory, a noise complaint gone too far. With no better options, police were forced to investigate even the most far-fetched theories. In the days before the murders, Mikio Miyazawa had filed a complaint about local skaters making noise behind the family's home. The area behind their property bordered Soshigaya Park, a popular hangout spot. Could this minor grievance have led to an act of extreme retaliation? Some believed it could. This theory gained traction when the killer's hip bag contained skateboard. Grip tape, the clothing he left behind, matched common street skater fashion of the time hand. One of the 3 men in the taxi that night had a bloody hand injury, but when police interviewed skaters in the park and surrounding areas, they found no connections to the family, no known tensions, no prior confrontations. The idea that a noise complaint could escalate into a massacre of a family of 4, including 2 children, was hard for both investigators and the public to accept. Still, the case had already proven to be unlike any other. The sand from California, and a shocking military connection. Of all the clues recovered, perhaps the most mysterious came from the grains of sand found inside the killer's hip bag. Forensic testing traced the sand not just to Los Angeles, but specifically to a region just north of the Mojave Desert, near Edwards Air Force Base. That detail opened the door to a chilling theory. Was the killer a U.S. military? According to theorists, the man may have been stationed at Edwards AFB, where he unknowingly picked up the sand, possibly in his gear or bag. Later, he was transferred to Yokota Air Base, which lies just an hour's drive from the home. This theory suddenly tied multiple loose threads together. The killer was athletically capable. Scaling a wall and climbing to the 2nd story, he showed no fear and operated with military-like precision. He had access to both Japan and the U.S. His hip bag, clothing, and sneakers were non-Japanese imports. Aligning with someone stationed abroad, he might have known some Japanese, either through family or military experience. Then came one final twist: his DNA profile. The mixed ancestry. Who was this man? Blood samples left at the crime scene allowed police to develop a genetic profile. The findings were unexpected. The killer had mixed ancestry. His father was believed to be of East Asian descent. His mother's lineage pointed toward Southern Europe. This raised the possibility that the killer was a biracial child, potentially the son of a U.S. military serviceman and a foreign national. Perhaps he had grown up around bases, traveled often, and had connections to Japan. It would explain his ability to navigate Japanese homes and routines, his partial knowledge of the language, his comfort in both cultures, yet belonging fully to neither to this day. The true identity of the Setagaya killer remains unknown, but in the next chapter of this story, we'll explore the investigative mistakes, the cultural barriers, and the tragic legacy left behind. Because the greatest tragedy of all isn't just that the killer vanished, it's that for innocent lives, Mikio, Yasuko, Rei, and Nina were taken in the most horrifying way imaginably. The person responsible walked away into the night, as if they had never been there at all. Setagaya murder's final theories and lingering questions. The nature of the attack, the sheer brutality, precision, and athleticism required led investigators to believe the killer was likely young and physically fit, capable of scaling the wall behind the Miyazawa residence and entering through a second-floor bathroom window. They also believed he may have been partially foreign, which could explain why no matches were found in Japan's official databases. But his familiarity with Japanese customs, language, and even the transit system suggested that he either grew up in the country or had spent significant time there. This allowed him to linger in the home for hours after the murders, knowing exactly how to avoid detection. Because this theory ties together DNA, behavioral patterns, geography, and mobility, it remains one of the most widely accepted explanations, both in law enforcement circles and among internet sleuths. But it's not the only theory. Years later, journalist Fumiya Ichihashi introduced a new possibility in his book on the case. The killer may have been a former South Korean military operative turned contract killer. According to Ichihashi, the Miyazawa family's neighborhood was in the process of redevelopment, and the family had been reluctant to move, delaying their departure multiple times due to concerns about their children adjusting. They had already sold their land, but remained one of the last families still living there. Ichihashi speculated that a construction company, eager to proceed with redevelopment, may have hired a hitman to force the family out in the most extreme way imaginable. He pointed to the sleazer sneakers, sold only in South Korea, and DNA markers more common among Koreans, as supporting evidence. If the killer had military training, that would also explain the physical capability, combat precision, and lack of panic at the crime scene. On paper, this theory answers a key question, motive, but it raises many others. Why would a professional assassin linger at the crime scene for hours, eating ice cream, using the toilet, and leaving behind an abundance of DNA? And why would someone trained to kill so efficiently display signs of overkill, especially against a child? Moreover, South Korean authorities cooperated with the investigation, running fingerprints through their national database, and still, there were no matches. That suggested the killer had either never entered the country legally or somehow avoided biometric registration, both of which seemed unlikely for a former soldier. Asterisk, then came a theory even more unsettling and implausible. On his podcast Faceless, journalist Nicholas Abragan explored the disturbing possibility that the killer was actually a teenager. At first, this seemed absurd. How could a child commit such a heinous act? But a post on the anonymous message board to Chan raised eyebrows. A user claiming to be 13 years old, writing under the alias Mr. Korematsu, made a chilling post just days before the murders. Now, when I see the happy family next door, I want to do something like that family murder case. The closing date is December 31st, 11:59 p.m. I'm thinking of killing them off before the 21st century arrives. What made this post even more disturbing was that it referenced a previous family massacre, eerily similar to the Miyazawa case. In that earlier crime, 3 were killed, and 3 more were left in critical condition, all at the hands of a 15-year-old boy. The Setagaya murders occurred just 2 days after Mr. Korematsu's post. Could it have been a confession or a prelude? If the killer had been a minor, his fingerprints wouldn't be in any criminal database. His last meal, string beans and sesame seeds, was also interpreted by some as a common home-cooked dish prepared by mothers, possibly suggesting he still lived at home. Still, the theory quickly falls apart. It fails to account for the sand traced to Edwards Air Force Base in California, the foreign-made shoes, and the sheer strength and violence required to carry out the massacre. Though the idea of a child killer is unsettling, most experts agree, this theory simply doesn't hold up. The investigation continues, and so does the grief, despite dozens of theories, thousands of tips, and a staggering 12,545 pieces of evidence. Police have never publicly named a suspect. The case has involved more than 246,000 investigators over 2 decades, making it one of the largest criminal investigations in Japanese history. In a last-ditch effort, authorities offered a 20 million yen reward, roughly $190,000 US, for any information that could lead to an arrest. It's the largest bounty ever offered in Japan, but nothing has brought them closer to the truth. Every lead collapses. Every clue becomes a dead end. And yet, the fight for justice continues. To this day, Setsuko Miyazawa, Mikio's mother, refuses to give up. Rain or shine, she stands outside Kito's Karasuyama station, handing out flyers to passersby, minding the world that her son, her daughter, and her 2 grandchildren were brutally taken, and that their killer still walks free. Case 3. The Alador family murders, Florida. It was the morning of April 30th, 1997, and for the Alador family in Miramar, Florida, the day began like any other. 29-year-old Marie Aladar was home, caring for her 2 baby girls, Samantha, just 2 years old, and newborn Sabrina, only 6 weeks old. Also in the house was Marie's mother, 68-year-old Teresa Laverne, who was there to help her daughter navigate the early weeks of motherhood. The home echoed with baby giggles, coos, and the steady rhythm of daily family life, just like every other weekday. Marie's husband George left for work at exactly 7 a.m. It was their normal routine as the hours passed. George checked in just as any loving father and husband would, especially with a newborn at home. He called once. No answer. Then again, still nothing. It was unusual. With 2 adults at home, someone should have picked up if they had stepped out. Marie would have surely called him back. But the silence only deepened his concern, sensing that something was wrong. George reached out to his brother-in-law and asked him to stop by the house. What he found would haunt the family and investigators for decades. Inside the home were the lifeless bodies of Marie, Teresa, Samantha, and baby Sabrina. All 4 had been murdered under horrific and inexplicable circumstances. The Alador family residence, a place once filled with warmth and laughter, had been transformed into a house of horror. But why? The family had no enemies, no known conflicts, no signs of criminal involvement. By all accounts, they were kind, faithful, and deeply loved within their community. So the question that still baffles investigators and shakes those who knew them to this day is, who would do this, and why? Case 3. The Alador family murders, Florida, 1997. In the summer of 1995, George and Maria Ladder welcomed their first child together, beautiful baby girl named Samantha. That same year, they made the move to Miramar, Florida, settling into a peaceful suburban neighborhood in a spacious 4-bedroom home with a backyard pool. They were building a life filled with promise. Marie began working as a secretary for the Dade County School Board's information office, where she also assisted in producing a Creole language morning radio segment. George, on the other hand, was a plant manager at Aqua Air Products in Hialeah, a marine air conditioning firm where he had worked for more than a decade. Ambitious and hardworking, George had also earned his real estate license, which he used to work part-time in the housing market. To their community, the Aladors were known as a quiet, devoutly religious family. Sundays were sacred, reserved for church services and gatherings with family and fellow parishioners. Their faith was the cornerstone of their lives, providing strength, routine, and a deep connection to their Haitian heritage and spiritual community. By early 1997, the family was growing once again. Marie was expecting their second child. In March of that year, she gave birth to baby Sabrina, their youngest daughter. With both a toddler and a newborn at home, Marie's mother, Teresa Laverne, flew in from Haiti to help her daughter through the challenging early days of motherhood. She arrived just in time to assist with caring for the girls and to attend baby Sabrina's upcoming christening. Planned for the first week of May, as any parent knows, those first few weeks with a newborn are intense, and having a mother's support is often a lifeline. For Marie, it must have been a blessing juggling sleepless nights, nursing, and caring for a toddler. Nothing, however, could have prepared them for what would happen next. The crime unfolds April 30th, 1997. The morning of April 30th began like any other in the Alador household. George left for work promptly at 7 a.m., as he did every weekday, inside the home. Marie, Teresa, and the two little girls were starting their day. With Marie still on maternity leave, she was almost always home, and her mother was there helping with the children. By early afternoon, George began doing what he usually did, calling home to check in. His first call came in around 2 p.m., no answer. He tried again an hour later. Still nothing. That wasn't like Marie. Even if she had stepped out for a walk or to run an errand, Teresa would typically answer the phone. The continued silence gnawed at George's instincts. Something didn't feel right. He called his brother, asking him to swing by the house and make sure everything was okay. Concerned, the brother-in-law brought his son along and arrived at the Alador residence around 5 o'clock p.m. At first, they knocked and called out no response. Then, they tried the front door. It was unlocked. What they found inside would haunt them forever. Just steps inside the house, they saw baby Sabrina's bassinet positioned in front of the TV. At first glance, nothing seemed off until they got closer. Sabrina was motionless, her tiny body covered in blood. The shock hit like a wave. In the kitchen nearby, they found Teresa, lying in a pool of blood, brutally murdered. In a panic, the brother-in-law grabbed his son and fled the house, screaming for help. Neighbors rushed outside, and one immediately called 911 at exactly 5:42 p.m., reporting the horrific scene inside the home. A scene of unimaginable horror when police arrived. Even the most experienced officers were unprepared for what awaited them. 6-week-old Sabrina, still in her bassinet, had been violently beaten to death with what was believed to be a blunt object. A few feet away, Teresa lay on the kitchen floor, shot in the head, and then bludgeoned repeatedly. The horror didn't stop there. Officers continued through the home and discovered 2 more victims. Marie was found face down in a pool of blood in the dining room. She had been shot multiple times, in the chest, stabbed, and savagely beaten in the head. In the living room, between the couch and a chair, they found 2-year-old Samantha. The position of her small body suggested she had tried to hide, but she hadn't been spared. She too had been beaten to death. The sheer brutality of the scene stunned investigators. A crime with no clear motive as detectives combed through the house. One thing quickly became clear. This wasn't a robbery. Nothing had been stolen. Jewelry sat untouched. Electronics remained in place. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors. Even more unsettling, the front door had been unlocked. This pointed to a chilling possibility. Whoever committed this massacre was someone the family knew, someone they let in willingly. Outside in the fenced yard, police found the family dog, but according to neighbors, the dog was unusually friendly, unlikely to bark or attack. Even when strangers were nearby, could the killer have slipped in unnoticed? Or were they someone so familiar to the family, they belonged there? Asterisk the message. On the wall, a false trail, as detectives continued searching. They found a cryptic message, scrawled in messy handwriting on the wall. I want my $100,000. Drug money. They stole my drugs. At first glance, it suggested a drug deal gone bad. Some kind of revenge plot. But that theory quickly unraveled. The house contained no drugs, no paraphernalia, no stashes, and most importantly, neither George nor Marie had any known involvement in illegal activity. They were a clean-cut, church-going couple with no criminal record. The message, police believed, was a deliberate misdirection, a smokescreen meant to confuse investigators. But there was one glaring, unanswered question. If this was just a staged scene, then who would do this, and why? The husband, George Alador, in the early stages of any family homicide. Law enforcement always looks closest to home, and George Alador quickly became a person of interest. When he arrived at the house and saw the chaos unfolding, George was caught on camera trying to push past officers to get inside, visibly distraught. At first glance, it looked like the reaction of a grieving father and husband, frantic, broken, desperate. But when detectives brought him in for questioning, his behavior shifted. George, known to be deeply religious, remained eerily calm, almost detached. He didn't ask about the investigation. He didn't demand justice. Instead, he simply said, "It's in God's hands now. God will prevail. Jesus knows." To the detectives, this response wasn't just unusual, it was deeply unsettling. Most grieving spouses are emotional, overwhelmed, and desperate for answers. But George seemed unmoved. His responses were vague. He offered no insight, showed no urgency, and barely engaged in the questioning before calmly standing up and walking out. Though George adamantly denied any involvement, and no physical evidence directly tied him to the crime scene, his behavior, combined with the lack of forced entry and no viable alternative suspects, made it increasingly difficult for detectives to rule him out. Continuing, the Alador family, murders investigation, and fallout as the investigation progressed. Suspicion around George Alador only deepened. At one point, George agreed to take a polygraph test, but the results were damning, indicating deception in several of his responses. While concerning, the test wasn't enough to build a case. Polygraphs aren't admissible in court, and without physical evidence to back up the results, detectives couldn't make an arrest. Shortly after that test, George stopped cooperating altogether. He refused to speak with investigators and withdrew from public life, only fueling their suspicions that he was hiding something. In the days following the murders, George moved in with his sister and brother-in-law, avoiding the media and community. He stopped going to church. He took a leave of absence from work, and those closest to him said it was clear he knew people were going to start asking questions. Questions he didn't seem ready or willing to answer. Meanwhile, detectives worked around the clock, reviewing evidence, ruling out theories. They ruled out robbery, they ruled out drugs, but they could never fully rule out George. Handwriting. Experts even compared George's writing to the message scrawled on the wall, the bizarre demand for $100,000 in drug money. But the analysis came back inconclusive. It wasn't a match. Still, that gut feeling lingered. George's behavior, his silence, his detachment didn't align with that of a devastated husband and father. Most people would do everything in their power to help the investigation, but from the start, George had been described as aggressively uncooperative. After just 2 interviews, he completely cut off communication with police. Then, detectives stumbled across something strange. At 7:09 a.m., on the day of the murders, just 9 minutes after George reportedly left for work, a phone call was made from the family's home. The call was to Marie's uncle in Washington, D.C. He didn't answer, but his wife did. At the time, she believed she had spoken to Marie, but later, after learning about the murders, doubt crept in. She admitted she wasn't entirely sure it was Marie on the other end. She had never spoken to her directly before, and couldn't identify the voice with confidence. This unexplained call raised an alarming possibility. If Marie was still alive at 7:09 a.m., then George, who had already left the house, couldn't have committed the murders. There simply wouldn't have been enough time for him to kill 4 people, clean himself up, and clock in at work by 7:30. But what if the person on that call wasn't Marie? Could it have been the killer? Detectives followed that thread as far as they could, but it led nowhere. They knocked on doors. They retraced George's timeline. They combed through his past. They reviewed security footage. But months turned to years, and the case grew cold. A $155,000 reward was even offered in hopes that anyone would come forward with information. But with no new leads, the reward was eventually withdrawn, and the case stalled. Grief, hope, and lingering suspicions, even as the years passed. Marie's family refused to give up. They held vigils, They organized memorials. They reached out to television shows and true crime programs, hoping that renewed media attention might bring fresh eyes to the case. Throughout it all, one belief remained unchanged within the family: George knew more than he was saying. Even detectives admitted that their only real suspect was George Eldar, but they never had enough to charge him. No weapon, no fingerprints, no DNA. In the words of Marie's relatives, "We're not giving up. The police aren't giving up. We're still out here as if it happened yesterday." Another family member said directly, "I'm telling them today, get ready, you will be found." The aftermath, a new life, more questions in the years. Following the murders, George moved on. He eventually relocated to Oklahoma and remarried. When Marie's family learned of the new marriage, they were stunned. But what truly enraged them was who he married. It was the same woman George had reportedly visited the night before the murders. He had told Marianne, later told police, that he was at her home to repair an air conditioning unit. But rumors soon swirled that George and this woman were having an affair. Whether that's true or not has never been proven, but the timing, the secrecy, and the eventual marriage only added fuel to the fire of public suspicion. Despite being the prime suspect, George has never been arrested, let alone convicted, in connection to the murder of his wife, his 2 daughters, and his mother-in-law, a crime without justice. The crime scene left such a psychological impact that several detectives and officers sought counseling afterward. The brutality was unlike anything they had seen. A 6-week-old baby bludgeoned, a mother shot, stabbed, and beaten, a grandmother executed, a toddler hiding behind a couch, hunted and killed, and still, no justice. Marie's family continues to carry the weight of their grief. Their pain has not dulled. Their faith remains strong, but so does their longing for answers. Cases like this remind us, justice may be slow, but it should never be silent. There, are families still waiting? There are victims whose stories must be told. And if sharing this case leads even one person to speak up, then maybe, just maybe, justice won't remain buried forever. Case 4. The Gilligan Family Murders, Evansville, Indiana, 1980. It was a cold day in January of 1980 when a family of 4 returned home after a long afternoon filled with simple joycerants, laughter, family time. But by morning, they would all be gone. In those final moments, Teresa Gilligan, a devoted wife and mother, didn't scream. She didn't beg. Instead, she used her last breath to comfort her terrified children, face to face with their killer. And within minutes, the entire Gilligan family would be annihilated in an act so depraved, it defies human comprehension. But what's even more disturbing, the man responsible would go on to become more famous than the family he destroyed, and that just doesn't sit right today. We're telling this story not to glorify a monster, but to finally put the Gilligan family back where they belong, at the center of their own story. Because while justice eventually came, it would take 25 years for the rest of the Gilligans to finally sleep in peace. And once you hear what happened, you'll understand why. That day had been a simple one, nothing unusual. Lisa and Gregory had some leftover Christmas money, and Patrick and Teresa decided to take them out to spend it. It was one of those small but meaningful outings, parents giving their kids a chance to pick out a toy or treat, something special just for them. Asterisk, after a few stops, the family visited the children's grandparents for a brief visit. Around 8 p.m., they pulled into their driveway on Aspen Drive, a quiet suburban street in Evansville, Indiana, where crime was rare and doors often stayed unlocked. It was the kind of neighborhood that felt safe, until that night. As Teresa and the kids entered the house first, Patrick stayed behind in the garage. But what none of them knew was that a man armed and already inside was waiting. Before Teresa could even react, the intruder pointed a gun at her and ordered her to keep quiet, with her 2 children beside her. She had no choice but to obey. The man forced her, Lisa, and Gregory to sit down, and then used whatever he could find, a vacuum cord and other household items to tie them up. Moments later, Patrick walked through the door. For a second, he might have been confused, maybe, thought it was a prank or a robbery gone wrong, but then he saw his family bound, scared, and a man holding a gun. And just like any loving husband and father, he tried to de-escalate. He pleaded, tried to reason, tried to protect. But the man wasn't interested in reasoning. He forced Patrick to the ground at gunpoint and tied him up as well. And then, in a bizarre attempt to calm them more, perhaps just to toy with their terror, he told the family he wasn't going to hurt anyone, that he was just there to rob the place and would leave once he got what he wanted. But that wasn't the truth. The killer would later admit that he had no plan to hurt the Gilligan family until Patrick tried to fight back. At some point, while the intruder was rummaging through the house for valuables, Patrick managed to loosen his restraints. Driven by desperation, he lunged, fighting for his family's lives. But the attempt failed. The intruder shot him, and when that didn't kill him, he grabbed a nearby dumbbell and beat Patrick until he stopped moving. And that moment, the moment Patrick died, was the turning point. The killer had crossed a line. Now, he couldn't leave witnesses. In cold blood, he turned to Teresa, Lisa, and Gregory, and executed them, one by one. Just imagine the sheer horror. Teresa, watching the love of her life, slaughtered in front of her. The children, frozen in fear, and still, even in the face of such horror, Teresa reportedly remained calm, likely trying to shield her children, emotionally, if not physically. But none of it mattered. The killer had already made his decision. The discovery, what the Gilligans didn't know, was that their home wasn't the only one targeted that night. Around 10:15 p.m., just 2 doors down, a neighbor, Ralph Hendricks, returned home and discovered his house had been burglarized. He immediately called the police. Indiana State Trooper Thomas Snyder was dispatched to Aspen Drive to investigate. Following standard procedure, he began canvassing nearby homes, checking in with neighbors. One of the doors he knocked on was the Gilligans. No one answered. Concerned, he walked around the side of the house and noticed something off. The glass pane on the back door had been taped and broken through, a technique often used to muffle the sound of forced entry. Snyder's instincts kicked in. He entered the house for a welfare check. What he found inside was beyond comprehension. A gruesome quadruple homicide. The crime scene inside the house was in total disarray. Teresa's purse had been emptied onto a chair. Nearby, a glass gun case lay shattered. Every firearm inside had been stolen. Drawers were pulled out, belongings tossed everywhere. It looked like a robbery that had spun wildly out of control. But it was the violence, the sheer brutality that haunted officers. The most in this quiet suburban home, an entire family had been annihilated. The first break as investigators processed the scene. Fear gripped the neighborhood. This kind of thing didn't happen here. People began locking their doors, watching their streets, wondering who would do such a thing. Then finalia, break. A neighbor reported seeing a suspicious car in the area the day before. A light blue, 4-door Plymouth, dented and in poor condition. In a neighborhood where people noticed unfamiliar faces, that car stood out. Police quickly reached out to nearby departments, asking if there had been any similar burglaries, especially involving taped windows, and they got a hit. 2 names kept popping up: Richard Milligan and Donald Wallace Jr. Both had long rap sheets. Both were known for drug use and burglaries. And Richard Milligan, he drove a blue Plymouth. Determined to find him, officers set up surveillance at Milligan's last known location. Hours passed. Then finally, the Plymouth pulled in. But the driver wasn't Milligan or Wallace. It was a woman, Debbie Durham. When questioned, Debbie explained she had borrowed the car from Richard Milligan. She agreed to a search of the vehicle, and what officers found shocked them. Inside were items reported stolen from the Hendras home along with a gun. Debbie was arrested and taken in for questioning. Investigators weren't sure whether she was involved, but one thing was clear: she was their best lead, the twist hunter interrogation. Debbie made a stunning claim. Richard Milligan couldn't have done it because he was already in jail at the time of the murders. That changed everything. There was only one other person who could have had access to the car and to the Gilligan home: Donald Wallace Jr., Debbie's boyfriend. A dangerous mind. Donald Wallace wasn't your average career criminal. Recently released from prison, Wallace was highly intelligent, with an IQ of 130. He used that intelligence not to better his life, but to manipulate others and evade accountability. But behind the sharp mind was a life defined by instability, drug use, and deep-seated anger, and soon, investigators would uncover just how far he was willing to go. Donald Wallace Jr. wasn't born a monster, but the man he became, cold, calculated, and unflinchingly brutal, was shaped by a childhood defined by neglect and instability. He was the son of teenage parents who divorced when he was just 5 years old. After that, Donald's life spiraled. His mother left him in the care of his father, a man who showed little interest in actually raising him. Donald described those early years as loveless and insecure, and the emotional damage ran deep. By age 11, he was already living in a psychiatric children's center in Evansville, the first of many institutions he would pass through in the next decade. By 14, he was deeply entrenched in the juvenile system, learning that in the world he lived in, violence equaled power. It was a lesson he never unleashed in the years leading up to the Gilligan murders. Donald wasn't known as a killer. He was a petty criminal breaking into homes to support a worsening drug addiction. But the darkness was there, always simmering. When investigators finally confronted Debbie Durham, his girlfriend, and the woman who had unknowingly driven the blue Plymouth tied to the crimes, she was hesitant to talk. That is, until she was shown the crime scene photos. Her disbelief quickly turned to horror. She had no idea he was capable of something like this, but even then, she couldn't say where Donald was. The last time she saw him was the night before, at her mother's house. Police followed the lead. Debbie's mother confirmed that Donald had stopped by between 7 and 9 p.m. that evening. She recalled him acting strangely nervous, erratic, carrying a jacket draped over his shoulder. Once inside, he laid out an unsettling display: several firearms, including a .38 caliber pistol, the same caliber used in the Gilligan murder, with jewelry, wads of cash, and a camera. The items matched descriptions from the Hendras and Gilligan burglaries, as if flaunting his crimes. Donald even had Debbie's brother take photos of him posing with the loot. But it didn't end there. Later, that night, Debbie's sister saw him start a fire outside the house. The family stepped outside, watching as Donald burned a pile of items, including the very jacket he had walked in with. A neighbor also reported seeing a man with shoulder-length hair standing by the flames. When police searched the area later, they found charred remains of the jacket, along with even more damning evidence: a set of wedding rings with stones missing, and broken shards of glass. Debbie then handed over a few of Donald's belongings: a pair of jeans, a glove, and a ring. The jeans tested positive for type AB blood, which didn't match Donald, but did match Teresa Gilligan and one of her children. The ring. Donald had claimed it came from a jeweler, but Teresa's mother identified it immediately. It was Teresa's wedding ring. And just to be sure, police tracked down the jeweler, who had resized it. He still had a photo record. There was no question. It was hers. The glove Debbie turned in also tested positive, this time for type B blood, which matched Patrick Gilligan. At this point, the case was airtight. Donald Wallace Jr. was responsible. A manhunt followed. His name and face spread across the news. And by January 15th, just one day after the murders, a tip came in. Donald had been seen in Newburgh, Indiana, hiding out with friends. By the time police arrived, he was gone. His friend said he'd left to go find Debbie. He knew he was a wanted man, and he needed answers. Had she been arrested? Had she talked? No one knew where he had gone, but everyone understood just how dangerous he truly was now. The capture later that same night, as officers prepared to call it quits, the phone rang again. It was a man named Bob Ashworth, a local coach. He'd been out walking his dog when he saw something suspicious, a man climbing into the attic of a nearby home at first. Officers were skeptical. They'd been chasing dead ends all day, but something in Bob's voice urged them to check it out. When they arrived, an elderly woman answered the door. She was surprised, but cooperative. She said she'd been home all day and hadn't seen anyone enter her attic. Still, she let them in and allowed a search. They climbed the steps, calling out. No response. Then the sound of a shotgun being chambered echoed through the small attic space. A voice called back, "Don't shoot, I'm coming down." And from the shadows, Donald Wallace Jr. stepped into the light, his hands raised. When asked for his name, he paused, then said, "Richard Milligan." But the officers already knew. The legal battle begins. At just 22 years old, Donald was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder. But before he could be tried, he was declared mentally incompetent and sent to a psychiatric facility. 2 doctors diagnosed him with acute paranoid schizophrenia, and he remained institutionalized for nearly 2 years. But by 1982, during a competency hearing, prosecutors painted a different picture. Donald had been faking. The trial was set. He maintained his innocence, claimed he was only there to rob the house, that some unnamed accomplice had carried out the murders. But no one believed him, and on October 21st, 1982, Donald Wallace Jr. was sentenced to death. The private confession publicly, Donald denied the murders, but privately, he confessed. In a letter to Teresa Gilligan's sister, he described what happened that night. He had broken in, searching for items to steal. Then, he heard the garage door open. He panicked, trapped. He pulled out his gun and took control, tying up the family. Then, Patrick broke free. Donald shot him and then, as he put it, the rest happened so fast. He claimed he didn't want to leave witnesses. And in what may be the most heartbreaking detail, he said he couldn't bear the thought of the children growing up without their parents, so he killed them too. The execution for the next 23 years. Donald Wallace fought to stay alive. He filed appeals, went on hunger strikes, tried every legal maneuver available, but eventually, he ran out of options, and when the end came, he didn't resist. He refused to file for clemency, telling his attorney not to submit the final appeal. "I'm ready to die," he said. "I'm so tired of doing time. The dying part is easy." On March 9, 2005, at the Indiana State Prison, Donald Wallace Jr. ate his final meal, steak, baked potato, soup, and chocolate truffle cake. He declined a spiritual advisor and spent his final hours with a few visitors before being moved to the execution chamber at 12:23 a.m. The execution was carried out just as at Lasta. Gilligan family Patrick, Teresa, Lisa, and Gregory were finally laid to rest, and after 25 long years, the community could breathe again, but the scars remained. This case is a reminder of how quickly a life can be shattered, how evil sometimes hides in the most unassuming places, and how long the road to justice can be. But, in the end, justice was served, and the story of the Gilligan family will not be forgotten. Donald Wallace Jr. was executed by lethal injection, and his final words were strikingly simple. "I hope everyone can find peace with this." But for the families he devastated, peace would never come easily. That same day, Diana Harrington, Teresa Gilligan's sister, lit candles at a private vigil not for Donald, but for the 4 innocent lives he had stolen. For years, Diana had made it her mission to ensure her sister, brother-in-law, niece, and nephew were never forgotten, never overshadowed by the man who destroyed them. In 2007, she and her husband, Ted Harrington, published a raw and personal account of their journey through grief and injustice. The book, titled Surviving the Death Penalty, chronicled the unimaginable pain of losing loved ones and the years they spent navigating a system that often seemed more focused on the rights of the killer than the lives of the victims. Donald Wallace would go on to become infamous, not just for the horrific nature of his crimes, but for the decades-long legal battle that followed. But no amount of courtroom drama could erase this one truth. If he hadn't broken into the Gilligan home that night, they would still be here. By now, Teresa and Patrick Gilligan would likely be grandparents. Their children Lisa and Gregory would be grown, building families of their own, creating memories, celebrating milestones, and continuing the legacy of love their parents gave them. But their story was stolen cut short in a single night of senseless violence. And while Donald Wallace is gone, his death did not end the pain, because justice doesn't always bring closure, and executions don't heal what was broken. Case 5. The horror of Cabin 28 in the early 1980s, Keddie, California, was little more than a faded railroad town tucked in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Quiet, isolated, peaceful. For Glenna Sue Sharp, the town represented hope, a chance to rebuild. Newly separated from an abusive marriage, Sue packed up her 5 children and left Connecticut behind. She arrived in Keddie in 1979 with almost nothing, but with one unwavering goal: to give her children a better life. The Sharps moved into Cabin 28, a modest wood-paneled rental in the Keddie resort. It was run down, the paint chipped, the floors creaky, but it was a roof over their heads, and it was theirs. Sue took odd jobs and relied on government aid when needed. She stretched every dollar. She was tough, smart, and fiercely protective a woman, doing everything she could to raise her family alone. Her children were adjusting to life in Keddie. John, 15, the eldest, had taken on a protective role. Sheila, 14, was mature, dependable, and often helped her mom with the younger kids. Tina, 12, was quiet and creative. Rick, 10, and Greg, 5, were still too young to understand the weight their mother carried, but they adored their new life in the woods. Despite financial struggles, the Sharps were tight-knit. They made friends, built routines, found small joys, but beneath the surface, shadows crept in. Sue had started receiving unwanted attention from certain men in town, especially from Martin Smart, a volatile local with a troubling past. He made her uncomfortable, but Sue wasn't easily rattled. She'd been through worse. She brushed it off, but Cabin 28 would soon witness something far more terrifying than harassment. April 11th, 1981. It started like any other evening. The Sharps settled into their night unaware that by morning, 3 would be dead, 1 would be missing, and their home would become one of the most gruesome and perplexing crime scenes in American history. At 7:45 a.m. on April 12th, Sheila Sharp, who had spent the night at a friend's house, returned home. She had no reason to be afraid, no warning that anything was wrong. But the moment she opened the front door, her world shattered. Inside the living room were the battered, blood-soaked bodies of her mother, Sue, her 15-year-old brother, John, and John's friend, 17-year-old Dana Wingate. The cabin, once full of life, had been transformed into a slaughterhouse. Blood was everywhere, splattered on the walls, pooled on the floor, soaking into the furniture. The living room bore signs of a violent struggle. Furniture overturned, bloodstains in every corner. One knife was bent nearly 90 degrees, a haunting testament to the force used in the attack. Sue's body lay near the couch, her hands bound with medical and electrical tape. She'd been gagged with her own underwear, secured with duct tape. Her throat was slashed, nearly decapitated. Her face had been bludgeoned beyond recognition with a claw hammer. John had been stabbed repeatedly, and showed signs he fought back. Dana had been strangled, then beaten so viciously his skull bore the imprint of the weapon. It was carnage personal, savage, and unrelenting. But perhaps the most disturbing moment came when Sheila cautiously crept down the hall and opened a bedroom door. Inside, she found her two youngest brothers, Rick and Greg, along with their friend, Justin Smart, completely unharmed, still asleep. Somehow, they had slept through the entire massacre, but Tina, 12, was missing. She wasn't with the boys. She wasn't among the victims. It was as if she had vanished, taken by someone. Sheila ran to the neighbors. Police were called, and within minutes, the quiet community of Ketty was plunged into chaos. A scene of unmatched horror when deputies arrived. The stench of blood hit them instantly. They stepped into hell on earth. What they found shook even the most seasoned investigators. This wasn't a random break-in. This was deliberate, intimate, rage-driven. The victims had been bound, tortured, and killed, with overkill, slashing, stabbing, bludgeoning, and Tina's disappearance only deepened the mystery. The murders were committed with multiple weapons, a claw hammer, 2 knives, and possibly more. The fact that the killers had time to do all of this without waking the boys or alerting neighbors was chilling, and the sheer brutality suggested more than one perpetrator. The scene told a story of control, violence, and a deeply personal motive. But who could have done this, and why? The mystery of Cabin 28 had only just begun. Sue Sharp's body had been partially undressed, a disturbing detail that suggested a possible sexual element to the crime. Yet, despite this implication, there was no definitive evidence of sexual assault. Nearby, the bodies of John Sharp and Dana Wingate lay side by side, mutilated beyond recognition. Dana's skull had been crushed, likely from repeated blows with a claw hammer. John's throat was slit so deeply it nearly severed his windpipe. But amid all the brutality, the most haunting mystery remained. Where was Tina Sharp? From the very beginning, investigators knew something about the scene inside Cabin 28. Didn't make sense. The level of violence wasn't just savage, it was deliberate, sadistic. This wasn't a moment of rage. It was methodical, controlled, ritualistic. There were multiple signs pointing to more than one perpetrator. The bindings on the victims were inconsistent. Some knots were precise and tight, others loose and hastily done. It was as if different people had tied up the victims at different times, each using their own methods. Blood spatter analysis added even more grim detail. It suggested that John and Dana were likely attacked first near the front door, then dragged to where their bodies were ultimately found. Sue appeared to be the primary target, suffering the most brutal and extensive injuries. Then came a chilling discovery. A section of wall insulation had been stripped away, possibly to muffle the sounds of what was happening inside. And a piece of medical tape, the same kind used to gag Sue, was found with bloodied fibers clinging to it as if it had been ripped from someone's mouth mid-scream. This was not chaos. It was planned torment. But what truly set this case apart was Tina. Her bed was untouched, her belongings left neatly in place. Unlike her younger brothers, who were left unharmed, Tina had been taken. The question was, why? Neighbors later reported hearing muffled screams around 1:30 a.m. that night, but no one called the police. Was it fear? Apathy? Or had the killers made sure no one would intervene? As the investigation launched, the focus shifted to finding Tina. Helicopters searched the dense forest. Volunteers combed through roads, rivers, abandoned train cars. Police even prepared for a possible ransom demand, but none came. She had vanished without a trace. Forensic evidence suggested she had been alive when she left the cabin, but for how long? And what had they planned for her? Weeks passed, then months, then years, and Tina's disappearance slowly turned cold, till 1984, when everything changed. That year, a call came in that shattered any remaining hope. A skull fragment, along with a decayed blouse, had been found near Feather Falls, nearly 100 miles from Keddy. Dental records confirmed it was Tina Sharp. Her remains had been exposed to the elements, discarded like trash, but near the site, buried in the dirt, lay something even more disturbing, a strip of medical tape identical to the kind used on Sue. Tina hadn't been killed in the cabin. She had been taken, held alive for an unknown period. And then, when her captors no longer had use for her, discarded. But use her for what? Despite the brutality, Keddy was wrapped in silence. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Leads dried up. Suspects avoided questioning or had alibis that felt too neat. Whispers spread that the killers were locals, people who had walked freely through town before and after the murders, blending in with everyday life. Two names stood out: Marty Smart, Justin's stepfather, and a known abuser, John Bo Boobied, Marty's friend, a former Chicago mobster with a shady past. Both had been at a local bar the night of the murders. Marty had a violent history and a deep grudge. Sue had reportedly been urging his wife, Marilyn, to leave him. Not long after the murders, Marilyn filed for divorce, citing that she feared for her life. Even more disturbing, Marty allegedly confessed to killing Sue during a therapy session, though he denied involvement in the children's deaths. Yet no charges were filed. Then came the anonymous phone call. After Tina's remains were found, someone called the police with the exact location before it had been made public. But that call, like so many other leads, was never properly followed. The case fell apart. Key evidence vanished. Crime scene photos disappeared. Marty's taped confession was lost. No usable fingerprints. No DNA analysis. No arrests. Decades passed, and the truth seemed buried forever. But the shadows of Cabin 28 didn't stay quiet. Silent witnesses. Two objects came to symbolize the horror: a claw hammer, used to bludgeon the victims, a steak knife, bent at nearly 90, from the sheer force of repeated stabbing. But strangely, one of the hammers went missing. A distinctive blue-handled hammer, known to belong to Marty Smart, had been logged as missing at the time of the murders. Marty himself told police it had been stolen. It wouldn't resurface for 35 years. In 2016, a man scavenging in a dried-up pond near Cabin 28 found a rusted, decaying hammer, the same make and model as the one Marty claimed was taken. Investigators believed it had been intentionally thrown into the water to hide it, though too much time had passed for forensic analysis. The discovery reignited the investigation. Meanwhile, the bent knife from the crime scene told its own story: either a killer attacking with uncontrolled rage, or victims fighting back with everything they had. Another knife, likely the deadliest, was never recovered, possibly taken by the killer as a trophy. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing valuable was stolen. This wasn't a robbery. It was targeted, personal, prolonged. Someone had wanted the Sharp family to suffer. In the weeks following, police narrowed in on their two primary suspects, Marty Smart and Bo Boobied. Marty lived just a few cabins down from the Sharps. He had a temper, a history of domestic abuse, and a motive. Sue was encouraging his wife to leave him. Marilyn later said Marty despised Sue, calling her names and blaming her for his failed marriage. On the night of the murders, he and Bo had been drinking at the bar. Marilyn recalled that Marty came home and burned a pair of bloody shoes in their fireplace. But perhaps the most disturbing moment came when Marty allegedly told his therapist, "I killed Sue, but I had nothing to do with the kids." That confession went nowhere. Bo, meanwhile, had no known connection to the Sharps, but his background was suspect. He had mob ties, had recently arrived in town, and was living with Marty. He was known to fuel Marty's rage, pushing him over the edge. Still, no evidence ever tied Bo directly to the murders. And shortly after, he vanished. Despite all these warning signs, the investigation collapsed. Vital pieces of evidence were mysteriously lost. Key leads were never followed. Witness statements went ignored. Some in Keddy believe there was a cover-up that Marty Smart's connection to law enforcement helped him evade justice. Years later, new investigators reopened the file and found that crucial witnesses had never even been interviewed. The case of the Keddy cabin murders remains one of the most disturbing and mishandled unsolved crimes in American history. 3 people murdered, 1 abducted, and decades of silence. The killers may be dead, but the horror of what they did and how the truth was buried with them continues to haunt the shadows of Cabin 28. Statements had been ignored, and as years passed, dark rumors swirled. Some whispered that Tina Sharp had been taken alive, possibly for human trafficking or even ritualistic purposes. But none of these theories were ever proven. No one was ever charged. No one was ever convicted. Martin Smart died in 2006, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. Bo Boobied passed away in 1988, never once facing trial. The case of the Keddy cabin murders remains officially unsolved, a case marred by law enforcement failures, lost evidence, and deep suspicion of a cover-up. Even as new evidence surfaced in 2016, including a hammer believed to match the murder weapon, many believe it was too little, too late, and the killers, they likely walked free. Case 6. The disappearance of the Chauhan family. Back in the early 2000s, specifically 2003, we turn now to Heathrow, a thriving hub in the United Kingdom. It was here that a freight business called Sabre Freight was making waves in the import world, especially in the lucrative fruit trade. At the center of it all was 46-year-old Amarjit Anil Chauhan, a businessman who had built a fruit empire from the ground up. Anil's story was one of determination. Born in India, he moved to the UK in his early 20s with a dream, and against the odds, he made it. He worked hard, climbed the ranks, and eventually became the proud owner of Sabre Freight Company. But Anil's world wasn't just built around business. He had a loving family, his wife, Nancy, who was 20 years his junior, and their 2 young sons, Devender and Ravender. Nancy's mother also lived with them, helping care for the children. The Chauhan home was filled with laughter, love, and promise. Still, Nancy longed for something more. Home. She missed India, the culture, the familiarity, the life she once knew. She often told Anil she wanted to return, believing India offered a better future and education for their boys. She urged him to sell the business and start fresh. Anil wasn't opposed to the idea, but he was cautious. He had poured his heart and soul into Sabre Freight and didn't want to make any rash decisions. If you asked any of his employees, they'd describe Anil as the ideal boss, kind, generous, and approachable. But he wasn't without a past. Back in 1996, Anil served 3 years in prison for tax evasion. It was a difficult chapter, but instead of letting it define him, he used it as fuel to rebuild. And rebuild he did. By the early 2000s, Sabre Freight was thriving. Then came Kenneth Regan in 2003. Regan applied for a job at Sabre Freight. On paper, he was a driver. In reality, he was a former drug smuggler and convicted felon. At first, Anil hesitated, but then he reflected on his own past, how someone had given him a second chance. So he decided to do the same for Regan. Regan was hired, and at first, he kept a low profile. He blended in. Nothing seemed off. Around this same time, Anil had begun seriously considering Nancy's request to sell the business and return to India. And that's when Kenneth Regan made an unexpected offer. He claimed to know someone willing to buy Sabre Freight for £3 million in cash. It was a tempting deal. It checked every box. Anil could secure a fortune, fulfill Nancy's dream, and retire in comfort. So, on February 13, 2003, Anil left his office, supposedly headed to Wiltshire to meet the mysterious buyer. But he told no one the buyer's name. No one knew the exact location of the meeting. He just left, and he never came back. That night, Nancy grew increasingly anxious. She called Sabre Freight, but no one had seen or heard from Anil. Then, her phone rang. It was a voicemail from Anil. "Hello, Nancy. Don't panic. I'm okay. I'll be back tomorrow." At first glance, it seemed reassuring. But something was off. Anil always spoke to Nancy in Punjabi, but this message was in English. The voice sounded like him, but the words didn't. Nancy felt a chill. She knew something was wrong. She called her brother, Amar, who lived thousands of miles away in New Zealand. Though they hadn't seen each other in nearly a decade, they remained close. It would be the last time Amar ever spoke to his sister. Days passed. Then, on February 17th, Kenneth Regan made a shocking announcement at work. Anil had sold Sabre Freight to a woman named Belinda Bruin and had decided to retire abroad due to Nancy's ill health. He even presented a letter, supposedly signed by Anil, confirming the sale and his intention to disappear from public life. Employees were stunned. No one had expected this. But the freight business moved fast, too fast, to stop and question it. People were anxious, but with no time to process. They kept working, unaware that something far more sinister had happened. Meanwhile, back in New Zealand, Amar was deeply unsettled. No contact, no calls, nothing. The family house in Hounslow appeared, abandoned. Neighbors believed the Chowans had moved back to India, as Nancy had always dreamed. But Amar wasn't buying it. Nancy wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. Not to him. Not to their mother. Frustrated by the lack of answers, Amar flew to the UK to investigate himself. Upon arriving at the Chowan home, he found the house in disarray. There were signs the family had left suddenly. Not packed. Not prepared. Taken. He went straight to the police. After presenting what he found, Amar finally convinced them to open a full investigation. The case was handed to DCI Andy Rowell, a seasoned detective who immediately began retracing the final steps of Anil Chowan, the first person he wanted to speak to. Kenneth Regan. Regan wasn't just any ex-con. He was a career criminal, a master manipulator. He went by many names: Ken Avery, Captain Cash. The nickname Captain Cash came from his habit of always carrying around huge sums of money, often stuffed into a briefcase. Behind the facade of legitimacy, Regan ran a web of front companies near Heathrow, using them to smuggle drugs. He had deep roots in organized crime, with connections to some of the most dangerous criminal families in London. In the late 90s, Regan was living lavishly: designer suits, gold watches, and a loyal circle of underworld associates. And it was in a fashionable London bar that his path first crossed with a woman named Belinda Bruin. The woman who would later be named as the buyer of Sabre Freight was no stranger to the spotlight. Belinda Bruin was a former celebrity agenta, socialite known for her glamorous lifestyle and connections in London's elite circles. Back then, she described Kenneth Regan as rough around the edges, not particularly well educated, but undeniably charming to her. He was the typical rich, wide boy, a man who believed his money could buy him class. But behind the charm lurked obsession. As time passed, Regan became increasingly fixated on Belinda. He bombarded her with calls and emails, saying things like, "I haven't felt like this in 30 years. You're like a drug." Whispers of a romantic relationship followed, though it was never officially confirmed. Then, on June 17, 1998, everything changed. Regan's world came crashing down. He was caught with 25 kilograms of heroin, a bust so massive, it landed him a potential 18-year sentence. Faced with serious prison time, Regan did what many criminals do when cornered. He flipped, becoming a supogress. He offered evidence that led to the conviction of 12 major figures in the UK drug trade. In return, his sentence was slashed. But when he finally walked out of prison 4 years later, Regan was a disgraced man, with nothing, his assets seized under a confiscation order, living in a tiny bungalow with his elderly father. Yet he hadn't changed. He wasn't interested in starting over. He wanted his criminal empire back, and Saber Freight and L. Chauhan's thriving business was the perfect cover. Belinda, now living in Devon after selling her Chelsea home, was dealing with struggles of her own. She had a huge mortgage, 2 children in private school, and her partner had just left. Life was unraveling. Then, Regan called. He claimed he had a new business venture and needed someone to run it. He offered her the role of managing director of Saber Freight, a job that paid £54,000 for just 2 days a week. When she hesitated, he sweetened the deal. £72,000. Tempted, Belinda agreed, but the job was never what it seemed. Soon, Regan was frequently visiting her home in Devon, using flimsy excuses to drop by needing help with forms, letters, or business matters. He became oddly fixated on her property, constantly talking about the mud in the lanes, suggesting cutting down trees, or building walls with electric gates. At first, it seemed like idle conversation. In hindsight, it was something far darker. Then came February 2003. Belinda had just started the job. She had a desk, a company laptop, access to Saber's books. But on her second day, she fell ill and decided to drive home early to Devon. That's when she found it. In her field, a battered Jaguar sat idle. Nearby, 2 men were operating a digger. They were William Hornsey and Peter Rees, both known associates of Kenneth Regan. Furious, Belinda confronted them. They claimed they were building a drainage ditch on her private land without permission. Regan arrived shortly after, trying to smooth things over. He smiled and said, "I thought you'd appreciate it." But Belinda was livid. She made it clear this was her property, and they had no right. The men backed off for now. By this point, Regan had nearly rebuilt his life. He had seized control of Saber Freight, turned it into a front for drug operations, and placed the woman he once obsessed over on the company payroll. But behind his comeback story was a chilling truth, and the police were finally starting to see through it. When detectives questioned Regan about Anil Chauhan's disappearance, he offered a story that felt too convenient. He claimed Chauhan was drowning in debt, unable to sell his business, and had simply vanished. But investigators weren't buying it. Using advanced forensic tools, they tracked both men's mobile phones. The trail was damning. Chauhan's phone, once active near his home in Hounslow, suddenly pinged near Stonehenge's, days after he disappeared. Not far from there, Regan's house in Wilton, Salisbury. Worse still, the 2 phones had been together, traveling south heading toward Exeter. The route wasn't random. It led them straight to Devont, to the farm owned by Belinda Bruin, Saber's newly appointed director. Detectives believed she knew more than she let on. They planned to question her, but just as they were preparing to confront her, they received a tip. It was from William Hornsey. He claimed Anil Chauhan was still alive and on the run. Hornsey said he was planning to meet Chauhan in Newport to deliver stolen passports. It was the break the police had hoped for. They raced to Newport, arriving at the iconic bronze pig statue near the passport office, where the meeting was allegedly set to take place. They found Hornsey and Regan waiting, but something felt wrong. Both men looked nervous, caught off guard. They claimed Anil had gotten spooked and backed out. Detectives asked for the phone number Chauhan supposedly used, but the number was unregistered and led nowhere. Once again, the case slipped through their fingers. Back at Saber Freight, Regan carried on as if nothing had happened, but the detectives weren't letting go. They brought Belinda in for questioning. When Regan found out, he panicked. He warned Hurst Ernley, "If the police ask why I was on your property, just say I was helping with the water system." During her interview, Belinda answered everything calmly until the final question. Was there anything unusual about Regan's behavior? She paused, then mentioned his warning. That single statement changed everything. Detectives immediately drove to Devon, convinced that a body, perhaps multiple, was buried on Belinda's land. They launched a full forensic excavation at the dig site Regan had worked on. For 5 days, forensic pathologists and archaeologists combed the soil, but nothing, no bodies, no remains, no evidence. The case was teetering on collapse until April 2003. A father and son were kayaking near Bournemouth Pier, enjoying an evening paddle, when they noticed something in the water. A body, bloated, lifeless, floating face down. The son called emergency services in a panic, while the father stayed behind, refusing to let the body drift away or be ignored. He waited nearly 3 hours, ensuring someone would come, and when authorities arrived, they were about to uncover a horror far worse than they had imagined. In a later interview, the man who discovered the body near Bournemouth Pier recalled how the sight had sent an ice-cold chill down his spine. The body was taken to a mortuary in Bournemouth, but it would take nearly a week before investigators confirmed what they feared most. It was Anil, the missing businessman. But the truth was far darker than anyone had imagined. The autopsy revealed a harrowing sequence of events. Anil had suffered blunt force trauma to the back of his head, a crushing blow that likely knocked him unconscious. Then, packing tape had been wrapped tightly around his mouth. He had been suffocated, silenced, his life stolen in a cold, calculated manner. It was a brutal death, but it wasn't the end of the story. As police processed this shocking discovery, their attention returned to Belinda Bruin's farm in Devon. This time, they weren't just looking, they were digging. What they found was haunting. Burnt clothing, jewelry, strands of human hair buried in the soil. Forensic tests confirmed the hair belonged to Anil Chohan. The pieces were coming together. Anil had been murdered, buried on Belinda's property, and then, later, his body had been exhumed and dumped into the sea. But one question loomed: why dig such a massive hole for one body? The excavation site was much too large, far more than was needed to conceal a single person. And soon, even more chilling evidence surfaced. Jewelry believed to belong to Nancy, Anil's wife. Tiny metal poppers from baby clothes. A horrifying possibility took shape. The entire Chohan family may have been buried there. With this new evidence, the investigation was officially upgraded to a Category A murder inquiry, the highest priority level, and at the center of it all stood one man, Kenneth Regan. But Regan, along with his associate William Hornsey, had vanished. Then one day, as Belinda Bruin was driving home, her heart stopped. She saw a car parked near her property, the same car she'd seen before. It was them, Regan and Hornsey. She stayed calm, despite the panic rising inside her. She smiled, said she needed to grab something from the sedan. The moment she was out of their sight, she bolted. Belinda jumped in her car, heart racing, and called the police. By the time officers arrived, the men were gone. That would be the last time anyone ever saw them together. But Belinda remembered something crucial. There hadn't been just 2 men digging that day. There were 3. The third, Peter Rees, now on his own. Rees was unraveling, haunted by guilt. He wandered from hostels to boarding houses, paranoid and restless. Then, one night, while staying in a small guest house, Rees opened up to the landlady. He asked her, "Have you seen me on TV?" When she said no, he confessed everything. He admitted to being involved in hiding the bodies of the entire Chohan family. He claimed he hadn't killed anyone, but described Regan as a psycho and accused him of personally shooting the 2 babies. The landlady, terrified, waited for the right moment, then alerted the authorities. 12 days later, Rees was in custody. Still, even after confessing, he refused to reveal where the bodies were buried, and without those remains, the case remained incomplete. Then came another horrifying development. A decomposed body was discovered by a fisherman. The police hesitated to show it to Anner, Nancy's brother, fearing it would be too traumatic. But Anner insisted. He had to see his sister one last time, even if it was the first time in nearly a decade. It was Nancy Choh. In April 2003, 2 months after the Chohan family vanished, Kenneth Regan was finally located. He had been hiding out in Belgium. He was arrested and extradited back to England. 6 weeks later, William Hornsey turned himself in. Now, with Rees, Hornsey, and Regan all in custody. Detectives were closing in, but there was a problem. None of them were talking. No confessions, no cooperation, and no bodies. Without strong physical evidence, the case remained fragile. Investigators needed more, so they dug deeper this time into phone records. The data revealed a chilling timeline. On the day Anil went missing, all 3 suspects had traveled south to Salisbury, stopping at an address known to police, 3 Forge Close Kenneth Regan apartment. The pattern was clear. During the days Anil was missing, at least one of the suspects was always present at Regan's flat guarding him, preventing escape. The theory was grim. Anil was held captive at that apartment, and during this time, his family Nancy, her mother Charanjit, and the 2 babies were abducted and murdered. Police believed Anil was eventually killed at the apartment, and the rest of the family in Hounslow. But the problem, it was all circumstantial. When detectives searched Regan's home, it had been meticulously cleaned. New carpets, fresh couch covers, every possible trace of violence erased. They had nothing to anchor the case. The country watched, horrified. A family had been wiped out, and their killers might walk free. But then came the miracle, a breakthrough no one saw coming. It came from Anil himself. 8 months after his body was recovered, forensic analysts re-examined the clothing he was found in. Inside his sock, they found something. Folded tightly, hidden, protected. A note. It was dated February 12, 2003, the day Anil disappeared. It was addressed to Kenneth Regan, 3 Forge Close. Police believe Anil, realizing he might not survive, wrote the letter in secret while being held captive. He folded it small enough to hide in his sock, hoping it would one day be found. The note survived burial, seawater, and months of decomposition, and now it would bring him justice. With the letter in hand, the case was no longer just suspicion. It was proof. The trial began in 2005, 2 years after the murders. It became one of the longest, most disturbing criminal trials in the history of England's Central Criminal Court. The evidence laid bare the depth of Regan's greed, his manipulation, and the merciless way he erased a family to seize a business. Peter Rees, the accomplice, who had helped hide the bodies, was sentenced to 23 years in prison. As for Kenneth Regan and William Hornsey, masterminds of the Plankeneth, Regan and William Hornsey, the cold-blooded masterminds behind the entire plot, were each handed 5 consecutive life sentences. It was the ultimate punishment, ensuring they would never again walk free. As the investigation unfolded, more tragic revelations emerged. The body of Nancy's mother, Taranjit Kaur, was eventually discovered off the coast of the Isle of Wight. Like Nancy and Anil, she had been drowned, but the deepest wound came from what was never recovered: the bodies of the youngest victims. 1-year-old Devinder and 8-week-old Rainder were never found. Though justice was served in the courtroom, the emotional devastation lingered. Nancy's brother Anchor, who had flown in from New Zealand to search for his missing family, carried a heavy burden of grief and unanswered questions. In an interview, his voice cracked as he wondered what his sister and her children must have endured in their final moments. Had they held on to hope, thinking rescue might still come? This case stands as one of the most haunting crimes in modern UK history, not just because of its brutality, but because of the innocence of its victims. A family full of life, love, and dreams destroyed without mercy. The fact that 2 infants were caught in the crossfire of such calculated evil is almost too much to comprehend. Case 7, the Delphi Murders, Monday, February 13, 2017. Abigail Williams, 13, and Liberty German, 14, known as Libby, were best friends, the inseparable kind. That Sunday evening, they were at Libby's house, savoring the rare treat of a Monday off from school. They spent the evening making art projects in Libby's room and tossing a softball in the backyard. By Monday afternoon, the girls had a new plan. Feeling adventurous, they decided to head out to the Manon High Bridge, part of a nature trail in Delphi, Indiana, quiet, wooded area known for its scenic views. Libby's older sister Kelsey gave them a ride and dropped them off near the bridge at around 1:30 p.m. The bridge itself was an old railroad trestle, abandoned for decades, but still a popular local spot for photos and peaceful walks. To the girls, it was just another place to explore and make memories. Libby even posted a photo of Abby walking across the bridge to Snapchat around 2:07 p.m. That photo would be the last known sign of life from either of them. When Libby's dad came to pick them up later that day, the girls were nowhere to be found. At first, it seemed like a miscommunication. Maybe they wandered off or lost track of time. But as calls to their phones went unanswered, panic set in. By evening, family and friends were out searching. Police were called. The woods lit up with flashlights, and the quiet town of Delphi rallied in support. Some speculated the girls had run off or were at a party, but their families knew better. They knew something was terribly wrong. The search paused at midnight, with law enforcement claiming there was no evidence the girls were in immediate danger. But by Valentine's Day, the worst fears came true. Less than a mile from where they were last seen, the bodies of Abby and Libby were found. They had been murdered. The investigation quickly turned into one of the most talked about cases in the country. Yet despite hundreds of tips and national media attention, the killer remained at large. Then came a major clue found on Libby's own phone. She had been filming Abby as they crossed the bridge, and in doing so, captured the image and the voice of a man walking toward him. He quickly became known as Bridge Guy. Still photos from the video showed him in blue jeans, a navy jacket, and a hoodie. Most chilling of all was the audio, a male voice commanding, "Down the hill." The public release of that clip was meant to stir recognition, to jar someone's memory. Police also shared two composite sketches, one of an older man, and another of a younger man based on witness sightings. But the case remained stalled. In a 2019 press conference, Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter made a direct, emotional appeal to the killer. "I know you're hiding in plain sight," he said, "and I believe you have just a little bit of a conscience left." The comment echoed throughout the community. Delphi was a small town, and now people looked sideways at neighbors, friends, even family. The police believed the killer had ties to Delphi. Maybe he lived there. Maybe he worked nearby. Either way, he knew the trails well, and that's what made the attack so terrifying. One early person of interest was Ronald Logan, a man who lived just a few hundred yards from where the bodies were found. At first, Logan told police he'd been out of town at an aquarium, but that story soon unraveled. He had asked a relative to lie for him about his whereabouts. That lie got the FBI involved. A month after the murders, agents secured a warrant to search Logan's home, property, truck, and digital devices. The FBI believed there was probable cause to suspect Logan may have committed the crime. The warrant revealed disturbing details about the crime scene. One of the girls was missing a piece of clothing. The bodies had been moved and staged. Unidentified fibers and hairs were found. And most chilling of all, the full video from Libby's phone lasted 43 seconds. Authorities had only released a snippet. Though Logan was never charged, the suspicion lingered, and the community waited, hoping for justice, haunted by what remained. Unsaid, there were no visible signs of a struggle at the crime scene, but the search warrant for Ronald Logan's property located just steps from where Abby and Libby's bodies were found revealed several deeply suspicious details. An FBI agent noted that Logan had asked a relative to fabricate an alibi for the afternoon the girls vanished. On top of that, Cell tower data showed his phone was near the trail when the girls were last seen, and later that same night, it pinged near the area where their bodies were ultimately discovered. As investigators dug deeper, more unsettling information came to light. Logan's ex-girlfriends came forward, describing a history of abuse. One of them claimed Logan had once threatened her, saying he could kill her and no one would ever find the body. The agent added another chilling detail. Both victims had lost a significant amount of blood. It was almost certain that the killer would have been stained either on his clothes, shoes, or skin. 2 pieces of clothing were also missing from one of the girls, and the way the bodies were arranged indicated they had been deliberately moved and posed. There was even speculation that the killer may have taken a souvenir or left the scene staged in a way that reflected some twisted ritual or compulsion. Investigators searched Logan's property thoroughly, hoping to uncover physical evidence linking him to the murders. Meanwhile, Logan insisted he had spent the day in Lafayette, 20 miles away, buying tropical fish. But when police followed up, his alibi fell apart. The relative who was supposed to confirm his story didn't back him up, and none of the details could be verified. Though nothing concrete tied him to the murders. Logan was arrested for violating his probation. He wasn't allowed to drive due to a previous DUI. Investigators believed that was why he asked for the fake alibi in the first place. While he was in custody, authorities conducted another full search of his property. But again, they came up empty-handed. The suspicions surrounding Logan faded after he died in 2020 from complications related to COVID-19. Just when it seemed the case had hit a wall, another name surfaced. Keegan Anthony Klein. At the time, Klein was 30 years old and already under investigation for catfishing young girls online. He operated a fake Instagram account under the username Anthony_shots, using pictures of a male model to lure underage girls into sending explicit photos. But this wasn't just another catfishing case. Klein had been communicating with Libby, German, on the very day she was murdered. Even more disturbingly, he allegedly told another girl that he had plans to meet Libby that day. Was this just an eerie coincidence or something much more sinister? Police wasted no time and searched Klein's home in Peru, Indiana. Though he wasn't charged with the Delphi murders, the investigation led to his arrest on 30 felony counts, including possession of child pornography and child exploitation. During the raid, authorities uncovered explicit images of minors. In court, Indiana State Police testified that Klein had manipulated girls aged 12 to 18 using fake personas. 11 victims were identified, though officials believe there could be many more. In a 2022 jailhouse interview, Klein admitted to soliciting explicit material from underage girls, but insisted he never intended to meet any of them in real life. "I was just lonely," he said. "I didn't have a girlfriend, and it spiraled out of control." Ultimately, Keegan Klein pled guilty and was sentenced to 40 years in prison, with an additional 3 years suspended. But despite the severity of his crimes, authorities still hadn't linked him directly to Abby and Libby's murders. The questions remained. Was he involved? Did he know who was? Years passed with no clear answers. Frustration grew in the community. 5 years had gone by. The case felt like it had gone cold, until October 26, 22, Richard Allen arrested in a stunning development. 50-year-old Richard Allen was arrested and charged with the murders of Abigail Williams and Liberty German. The news sent shockwaves through Delphi. Allen wasn't an outsider. He was a well-known figure in the town, a husband, a father, and an employee at the local CVS. In fact, he had even developed photos for the victims' families. The unimaginable had become reality. The suspected killer had been hiding in plain sight all along. Nearly 6 years, over 70,000 tips, countless sketches, and the now infamous, grainy video. And all this time, the man investigators were looking for was right there, walking the same trails, living a normal life. Witnesses came forward claiming they had seen a man resembling Alan on the trail that day. One even described seeing someone walking down the road with muddy, possibly blood-stained clothes. The break in the case came when a unspent bullet found at the crime scene was matched to a firearm owned by Alan. It was a powerful piece of evidence, one that tied him directly to the scene. Alan's defense team, however, quickly issued a public statement, insisting their client was innocent and had cooperated with police from the start. They claimed Alan had voluntarily informed law enforcement in 2017 that he had been on the trail the day of the murders. He'd even met with a conservation officer to discuss it. According to the statement, Alan didn't try to hide, flee, or destroy evidence. He continued living his life, working his job, and maintaining his routine for 5 years. Still, the most dramatic revelation came later. Confessions court documents alleged that Richard/Alan had confessed to the murders not once, but multiple times. According to the filings, Alan made these confessions during phone calls from jail with his wife Kathy, and even his mother. In each case, the calls ended abruptly after his alleged admissions. Following these conversations, Alan's mental health reportedly began to deteriorate rapidly. What started as a moving impossible two-crack investigation had now become something else entirely. A courtroom battle to prove guilt or defend innocence. Even now, the town of Delphi waits, hoping that the case finally closes for good and justice is fully served. Richard Allen's condition began to rapidly deteriorate behind bars. He stopped eating, lost weight, and became increasingly erratic, at one point even destroying his only connection to the outside world, his prison-issued tablet. His behavior became more disturbing, including eating legal documents from his defense team. This descent raised major concerns. Alan's attorneys argued that the confessions he'd made, some more than 60 in total, were not reliable. They claimed he was under extreme psychological distress, worsened by his isolation in protective custody. Despite these pleas, the judge denied their request to move him to another facility, stating that Alan was already receiving better care than most inmates. Then, in a stunning twist, the defense filed a 136-page memorandum that completely shifted the narrative. According to the filing, Alan wasn't the real killer. They claimed the murders were the work of a group of individuals practicing a pagan Norse belief system known as Odinism. The defense argued that key elements of the crime scene pointed to a ritualistic motive connected to this obscure faith. They cited a 2017 FBI memo that revealed previously undisclosed details about the crime scene. The girls' bodies, it stated, had been staged in a deliberate and symbolic way, according to texts allegedly written by Abby's uncle, which circulated online before the trial. Abby was found clothed, while Libby was naked and partially covered with sticks and leaves. Their throats had been slashed. The defense highlighted symbols at the scene that resembled Norse runes. They claimed these markings, found on trees and bodies, suggested the involvement of Odinist practitioners. One of the more disturbing claims involved Libby's body being positioned at the base of a tree. Her left arm was extended upward, touching the trunk, while her right arm lay at her side. Branches were arranged in a specific pattern across her body, including one large branch laid from her head to her feet. Abby's body, found only feet away, was fully clothed but in Libby's sweatshirt and jeans. The defense theorized Abby had been killed earlier and redressed. Her body showed little blood beyond the neck, possibly indicating attempts to keep her clean. She was posed with one leg tucked under the other, and sticks had been arranged in a star-like asterisk pattern over her. Above her head, small branches had been placed in a way that mimicked antlers or horns. Nearby, a red, F-shaped bloodstain, confirmed to be Libby's, was found on a tree. The defense claimed it resembled a Norse rune symbolizing Odin. They also pointed to the rune Hagalas allegedly marked on Abby's body, associated with chaos, hail, and sacrifice in Norse mythology. This theory took the case in a chilling new direction. The defense claimed Abby's boyfriend's father, referred to only as BH, had ties to Odinism and posted disturbing content online, some of it referencing details about the crime scene before they had been made public. One meme posted, "Days after the murders," joked about hiding a body and staying quiet. Another individual allegedly confessed involvement in the murders to someone close, but this confession was never fully pursued. The defense also alleged that certain law enforcement officials believed in the Odinist cult theory, but were pressured to stay focused on Allen as the prime suspect. Adding to their argument, the defense said Allen had been psychologically broken by months of confinement. They claimed he had been manipulated or coerced by Odinist-affiliated guards into confessing. They also accused the lead investigator of omitting crucial information when applying for the search warrant on Allen's home, and noted that 70 days' worth of witness interviews had been destroyed, potentially critical early evidence lost forever. In 2024, a 3-day evidentiary hearing was held to examine these claims. The prosecution pushed back hard against the Odinism theory. A blood spatter expert testified that the stain on the tree was not painted or ritualistic, it was a simple transfer mark. However, the expert couldn't say who transferred it. The defense, meanwhile, maintained that Allen's confessions were the result of stress-induced psychosis. Witnesses, including medical professionals, described his mental decline, paranoia, and bizarre behavior in prison. A DNA expert added that there was no trace of Allen's DNA at the crime scene, nor was there any DNA from Abby or Libby found among Allen's belongings. Still, the prosecution held firm. Their key evidence, a single unspent .40 caliber bullet found between the girls' bodies, according to the state's expert. That bullet was a match to Allen's Sig Sauer pistol, but the defense challenged this too. They argued there were not enough forensic images of the cartridge to verify the match. They even raised the possibility that the bullet could have come from a law enforcement-issued firearm, casting serious doubt on its origin. The prosecution also leaned heavily on the now infamous video clip Libby recorded before the murders footage that captured the voice of bridge guy, Master Trooper Brian Harshman, who had reviewed over 700 of Allen's prison calls, testified that the voice in the clip matched Allen's. Despite public skepticism and swirling conspiracy theories, the case reached its climax. On November 11, 2024, Richard Allen was convicted on all counts. A month later, on December 20th, Judge Fran Gull handed down the sentence, 130 years in prison. That's 65 years for each of the girls' murders, to be served consecutively. Allen was immediately transferred to the Westville Correctional Facility to begin his term. But even with a conviction, questions remain. Why did it take more than 5 years to connect Allen, an ordinary man living in plain sight, to a crime that shook the country? How did he go unnoticed despite the witness sketches, the audio clip, and his own admission of being on the trail that day? And why did his arrest happen so close to a contentious sheriff's election? Some see justice finally served, see loose threads, and too many unanswered questions. One thing's for sure. The Delphi case has left a permanent scar on the heart of a small town, and its haunting echoes continue to stir debate to this day.